Welcome back, everyone. This is another lecture on Midsummer Night's Dream. We're going to do Act 3 today. My name is Roger Green, if you haven't seen any of my earlier lectures. So I'm going to start off just kind of with my normal sort of contextualized reading that I've been doing in earlier lectures, and then I'm going to jump in a little bit in 3.2 or Act 3, Scene 2, to some interpretive methods, and particularly going to talk a little bit about psychoanalytic criticism. And I have a purpose to where I'm going with some of this stuff, but you're going to get a little bit more of me individually, and some of my interpretive interests here. My purpose is to kind of contextualize the historical moment more than it is to directly apply something like Sigmund Freud. I want to give us a little bit of historical distance between how we tend to sort of think things commonly in the 21st century versus perhaps the ways that people were thinking or not even considering in Shakespeare's time. And so that'll come later on. Let's jump right now into Act 3, Scene 1. And so this begins with the underplot, right, that I've characterized. And I will explain more and more this idea of what I call a European fantasy structure. It's hierarchical all the time. And so remember from an earlier lecture, I said the overplot was going to be Theseus and Hippolyta and their marriage. That structures the whole play. And then there are the underplot here is going to be the Peter Quince and the artisans like Bottom and Flute who are playing in the play. They are sort of amateur actors, right? And so Bottom, his name is literally bottom, right? Literally low. And so we begin in Act 3, Scene 1, with Bottom kind of critiquing and censoring the play that they're doing, Pyramus and Thisbe. Earlier on in the play, he was saying that he could play all of these different parts. He could be the tyrant just as well. He could play the lion. And he uses bad writing as a kind of over-explaining, as a way to adjust the play. And we see this kind of critique, this kind of foolish critique of writers. Later on, we'll see it in Hamlet with a character like Polonius. The people who don't quite have the linguistic ability that Shakespeare has, and what he's doing again is he's teaching the audience about how they should watch, like how they should engage with the plays that he is putting on. Let's see. So Shakespeare here is also, he's poking fun at both popular audiences, the people who didn't go to Oxford, who were to get educated, and the royal censors here. As we know, there was this is a period of heightened attention to especially religious language in England in Elizabethan times and what can be said or not said on stage. And Shakespeare seems to be using Bottom to as a safe character, right, because of his sort of lower class stature, to talk about like what's appropriate and what's not appropriate to be said on stage. And Bottom is saying things like, well, if we're too realistic, we're going to scare all of the women, and we don't want to scare all of the women, right? So he starts taking on this kind of censor role. And so he's also kind of critiquing anybody who thinks that they're trying to kind of get too lofty. So again, using Bottom's character as well to perhaps again on another layer give a critique to the Oxford educated people who are making fun of Shakespeare and amateurs like him who have come to the London scene. So it doubles the insult to the more scholarly peers while allowing Shakespeare to masterfully attend to the diverse social perspectives simultaneously and entertainingly. So everyone can laugh, and no one particular segment of society is overtly or overly ridiculed or singled out. So this again is satire, right? As opposed to parody, because parody would be more specific. But satire is a general sense, and the way that Shakespeare seems to be doing it is this simultaneously layering different classes of society on top of one another. So it's just vague enough, it's just ambiguous enough not to just directly signal one particular group. So Bottom has his own wisdom at the same time. And some say, at least one, I think I've mentioned this in an earlier lecture, at least some people see his love affair with Titania, which is showing up in this act, as one of the purest of all in Shakespeare's works. So even though it happens in this dream state and Bottom's been had an ass's head put on his head, there's something sweet about the relationship between him and Titania. And so Peter Quince is relatively quiet here, but sometimes, of course, we might see Peter Quince as a mouthpiece for Shakespeare the playwright. You know, he's in this in-between space. He knows more of what is supposed to happen in the play, and so he's having to counter Bottom's remarks. So Bottom's censoring is a kind of surface level misogyny or woman hating. He thinks he needs to step in and protect the ladies, and he wants prologues to state that it's only imaginary, right? like don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to put on is just going to be part of the imagination. Now keep this in your mind when we come back to the end of the play and we get Robin or Puck's little message at the end of the play, which seems to be responding to this. And you know, there's a lot. It's an early-ish play in Shakespeare's career. I've already mentioned that putting fairies on stage is a big deal. He's dealing with paganism. Like, Shakespeare knows that he's probably pushing a lot of people's buttons. And so this part of the play, I think, is really actively trying to get censors and audience members, people who might start, having their triggers triggered, to ease off, right? So here Shakespeare uses comedy and relies on the audience's imagination to both laugh at Bottom while simultaneously drawing them deeper into the story. We're laughing at Bottom saying, like, ladies and gentlemen, it's just a play, right? And at the same time, we're being drawn deeper into the play. And we're casting off our own expectations as an audience as to whether or not the play needs to be real. So by laughing at Bottom, one becomes more invested in the play. It's a really genius kind of device when you start kind of pulling it apart and thinking about it. There are some references to almanacs and calendars about moonlight. Again, I mentioned earlier in a lecture, if we're writing papers on this play, tracking something like moonlight, here's another instance where there's an area for research. It's like, oh wow, I should maybe think about the ways calendars might have been different, or people might have thought about time and seasons and months a little bit differently. in the late 1500s than they might do in the early 21st century. So there's some references there, and then Puck or Robin enters into the play here. It all seems to be a kind of commentary on how much an audience needs by the ways of prop and scenery to believe a story. And here we get rehearsing the play, getting lines wrong entrances. And Robin at this, or Puck, breaks the fourth wall in stage acting. So if you don't know this reference, you can think about looking at the stage as a box, and when an actor on stage turns to the audience, and sometimes called an aside, which is where we sometimes see parentheses from in writing, and it directs away from the text, and an actor directly addresses the audience. So this again is, I think, a foreshadowing of what Robin will do at the end of the play when he does come out and give us a direct address, talking about the whole play to wrap up the play itself. So he transforms Bottom into an ass here, by saying he's going to turn him into the truest horse, right? And of course, instead he turns him into a donkey, playing on donkey and horse, and then ass. So Bottom literally becomes an ass, and Puck singing here mocks hymn meter. So this is about 3.1, lines 120 to 130. So if I could just find that in my text here. What do I mean by hymn meter? Okay, so the Book of Common Prayer had come out, and hymns were popular at the time in more Puritan language. This is I think a little bit later. Isaac Watts's book on Puritan education displays a lot of this, but the easiest way I can think from the outside here is to think about a popular hymn like Amazing Grace. Like think about the meter here, or the it's iambic. So Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. That's 8, line of 8, that saved a wretch like me, right? Da 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 da, right? That's iambic, but it's 8/6/8/6. That's hymn meter. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Meow 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 meow. Right? We can hear the sound. We can hear that halving sound that I alluded to earlier as well. Where and we could look at Irish verse and 8/7s and 8/7s and feel something a little bit different. So hymn verse, of course, is going to be associated with the church, the Anglican Church, and Christianity. And Bottom here is able to use that verse, but of course he has been charmed by this pagan magic and all this sort of stuff. So there's a lot of that you can sort of read into just the meter that's being used here as a subtle critique of perhaps the kind of overly Christian situation that the political situation in England has happening. And so at 120, Bottom says, I will walk up and down here, and I will sing that they shall hear I am not afraid. So he's been turned into an ass, right? So the ousel cock, so black of hue, with orange tawny bill, the throstle with his note so true, the wren with little quill. And Titania is waking up. It's literally like, so this hymn meter is kind of waking her up. Meanwhile, Peter and Flute and like the other guys have kind of run off, afraid of Bottom and his face. Titania wakes him. What angel wakes me from my flowery bed? Right. So references to angels here. Bottom says, the finch, the sparrow, and the lark, the plain song cuckoo gray, whose note full many a man doth mark, and dares not answer nay. For indeed, who would set his wit to so foolish a bird? And so there's also, remember back to Titania's speeches about nature earlier on, which was, I think, maybe given in a much more serious register, but of this kind of different kind of discourse on nature and birds is showing up here. Who would give a bird the lie, though he cry cuckoo never so? Says Bottom. And Titania, I pray thee, gentle mortal, sing again. Mine ear is much enamoured of thy note, so is mine eye enthralled to thy shape, and thy fair virtues force perforce doth move me on the first view to say, to swear, I love thee. And so on and so on. We get this hilarious exchange. So this is pure carnival, right? This is like the ability to be in the forest. Rules have gone away, and everything is sort of at play, including libidinous sexuality. Bottom gets his own fairy servants. Titania says, the moon, methinks, looks with watery eye, and when she weeps every little flower, lamenting some forced chastity. Again, this kind of language that alludes to the grandest of things, the moon, how it interacts with this, with like almost like astrologically, right? But all the way down to the flowers, and that makes them weep. And then what are they weeping about? Some sort of forced chastity, right? So again, the sexual language is rather overt here. Again, Bottom becomes a gentleman with fairy servants. So this is another kind of reversal or inversion between Bottom, who's on the bottom, who comes to take whose place? Well, Oberon's place, right? The king of the fairies, because Titania has fallen in love with him. And then Oberon is also a kind of double character of Theseus in the so-called real world of Athens here in the play. If some of you might know the images of the wheel of fortune, or fortune's wheel, and at the top is the king and the bottom is the lowest sort of beggar. Again, that mimics this kind of Euro-Christian, even though the Fortuna is a pagan concept, pagan deity, if you will. The world view of the universe, that you can be on top or the bottom, and that fortune's wheel is going to shift, and you'll fall from fortune and become the king, will become the beggar, and then it goes in a kind of circle or a cycle. That seems to be at work. That's a very medieval concept of our worldview that is shifting in Shakespeare's time towards more linear forms of providence. Okay, I think that's enough for 3.1. Let's go to Act 3, Scene 2. Which begins with Oberon and Robin, who are discussing how the plan of theirs has worked out, right? The situation with Titania and Bottom, as Oberon says, falls out better than I could devise. But they find out that Lysander was dosed instead of Demetrius. And this is another reversal, right? This reversal makes both of them love Helena instead of Hermia. And so Oberon corrects this later on by dosing Demetrius. But what's happened here is that there's this again, another almost like play within a play, where there's this massive reversal of the beginning of the play. And now the lovers are after Hermia. And Hermia's response throughout the act is that Lysander is joking. And then so Hermia's response is that Lysander's joking when they've woken up and she finally finds him, and he's kind of telling her no. Helena's response is kind of disbelief, and she thinks that Lysander is joking too, but she sees it in a more biting way. So she thinks Lysander and later both Demetrius and Hermia are all mocking her, right? So here, love, throughout the act, love becomes libidinous and blind desire, interchangeable passion and scorn, right? And it does, throughout this portion of the play, that does become this kind of like masculine kind of rivalry between Lysander and Demetrius that's been going on throughout the play, but it just becomes like this kind of like sword fighting, dueling, like kind of cockfighting, if you will. And it's funny. It takes all of the kind of seriousness out of that kind of violence, and we're able to sort of laugh at this as just kind of the lovers rivaling each other. So the audience here. So actually, before I get here, Shakespeare uses this rhetorical device throughout the play, and it's called Isocolon, right? You can look it up in a book of rhetorical terms. Like I've got one here. You can look it up online too, but I still use books. So Isocolon just it's also has some other names like paramember or parison. You don't need to remember all the terms, and you don't even necessarily need to remember Isocolon. You probably won't from one lecture, but it's a particular phrasal type of punning, is the way I would put it in my own mind. But I'll read the definition here from Richard Lanham's book, Handlist of Rhetorical Terms. Phrases of approximately equal length and corresponding structure. So Winston Churchill, speaking about the life of a politician, combines this figure with pun and climax when he says, he is asked to stand, he wants to sit, and he's expected to lie. I came, I saw, I conquered, or Veni Vici. This is that's a common use of the isocolon. But I think that another example here they give is Francis Bacon's laconic, never complain, never explain, has served generations of later statesmen. So we see it in political language. Sometimes the similar elements are built into larger structures, and that's why I think Shakespeare is doing a lot. And so here's an example actually from Love Labour's Lost, another Shakespeare play. Your reasons at dinner have been sharp and sententious, pleasant without scurrility, witty without affection, audacious without impudency, learned without opinion, and strange without heresy. Right, so that kind of repeated structure that you can feel going on there, that's a really nice example. They say a narrower definition can call for the clauses to have the same number of syllables. So there's a short version of it here. So what I was saying earlier lectures, that there's a tit for tat. Sometimes the structure of the sentence between two characters will show up, and that's how Shakespeare is showing his ability as a writer to shift even between two perspectives or multiple perspectives. And you see that kind of line shifting, the quick line shifting between characters throughout this play. Sometimes the parallels will work between two different characters' perspectives. But there's one I think I noted here at 3.2.7, 3.2274. So I do believe it's Hermia who's doing this. And Hermia is saying, again, she doesn't understand why Lysander is rejecting her. She says, "What can you do me greater harm than hate? Hate me? Wheretofore? O me, what news, my love? Am I not Hermia? Are you not Lysander?" So that kind of questioning is alluding to it. I am as fair now as I was erewhile. Since night you loved me, yet since night you left me. Since night you loved me, yet since night you left me. So you see the kind of structural parallelism going on with the language. And there's something that in doing this over and over again throughout the play in different ways, emphasizes at the level of the line the fact that things are interchangeable in the forest, that lovers can be interchanged, that there can be reversals, inversions, all sorts of things. That kind of language is performing what the play is actually about. So that becomes really a kind of deep way that Shakespeare is dealing at the linguistic and at the structural language of his sentencing and perspective and shifting, what he's trying to get at in terms of the theme of the play. Again, I mentioned how he loves Ovid, and Ovid's Metamorphoses do this all the time. It's about change and changeability or interchangeability. And that is also associated with magic and with paganism and things like this as well. So the audience has been brought at this point in the play in Act 3 to the very fiction of comedy, where all of this stuff, these interchanges can happen with impunity, right? We can laugh. We know that we can laugh about it. We know because it's not true. Yet we didn't need to have someone at the beginning of the play necessarily do what Bottom was saying needed to happen so that the ladies don't get scared in their version of Pyramus and Thisbe. So we know it's not true, yet from the satirical situation, we're able to also laugh while kind of making fun of ourselves and maybe making fun of the society that we live in. So now this gets at something that Aristotle had said, that drama, so drama just means action, right? At a distinction between tragedy and comedy. And we have in Aristotle's Poetics mostly his notes on tragedy, but not so much what he actually said on comedy. Other people have written books about comedy and laughing, such as Henry Bergson, for example. But at least Aristotle and Shakespeare seems to have at times understand what's going on in Aristotle's Poetics, even though he changes the rules on a regular basis. Aristotle said that one of the reasons why we have tragedy, especially, and maybe drama altogether, is this notion of catharsis or purging. That what we have in a society is built up tensions, emotions that need to be purged. And he is using this as a way to address something that Socrates in Plato says in the Republic, that we should only have art that praises the Republic, that praises the state. We should get rid of the poets like Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad, even though Socrates loves them, because even, as much as he loves them, he thinks that poetry that's not state-based riles up people's emotions and has a bad influence on them and causes them to do bad things that then disrupt the state, right? And so we can think about this all the way to, like, I don't know, violence in video games. Just playing a video game, does playing Mortal Kombat or something make you into a violent person? Same sorts of censorship discussions What does art do? How does media influence us? We're still dealing with the issue today. And Aristotle's response in his Poetics was, and part of why he's producing the Poetics is to actually say, well, no, actually we need to have these stage plays, we need to have poetry because it allows society to do this thing called catharsis or purging. Now, Aristotle's version of purging is going to be different than Christian notions of purging or purgation and purgatory. I'll talk more about that when we get to Hamlet. But Aristotle did see this as a function of tragedies, that through pity and terror, especially these very serious plays, they give us pity and terror for people who've made these awful blunders, like Oedipus, who needs to put out his eyes and blind himself because he didn't realize that he'd slept with his mother, he'd killed his father, all of these tragic things that have happened. And so that's supposed to make us in the audience, according to Aristotle, feel pity and terror, and to show us what becomes of unrestrained desires and impulses. Right? So that's what tragedy does. What comedy seems to be doing is something different. It allows us, in a particular kind of frame, to be less restrained with our emotions, with our desires, and especially with sexuality. So in earlier lectures, I've said that comedy, again, it seems to be about producing a kind of carnival festival structure that allows people to be looser with their sexual morals, perhaps, and kind of get it on. And through that getting on, people get pregnant, children are born, and then we have a new population of society, right? So it allows for the production of the next generation of society when we loosen up our morals around our feelings around sexuality, which tend to have all sorts of rules around them. I'm going to talk about rules in a second with psychoanalysis. But so in another difference between comedy and tragedy, and I'll use these terms at length more and when we read tragedies, is that there is peripeteia, or a reversal, inversions of fortune, like between Bottom and Theseus or Oberon, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but there is no anagnoresis, which is the recognition that somebody has done something wrong. So in the famous tragedy of Oedipus, Oedipus has this moment of recognition where he's like, oh my God, everything that I tried to do to get out of this thing that I was fated to do, which was he was fated to sleep with his mother and kill his father, to sleep with his mother, right? So he tries in his life to get away from his fate, and he can't do it. And in fact, everything that he does in trying to get away from it is what brings about his actual fate. So this is an ancient, way of thinking about the world and fate. Which comes from, it's like fate usually literally means the voice of the gods. And so we're supposed to feel pity for Oedipus. We're not supposed to blame him. A modern audience are kind of like, duh, well, why didn't you just do something different? And sometimes people, when they're reading plays or reading novels, like, well, I think that the character should have done this instead of this, or I think it should have had this kind of ending. And it's like, well, that takes us away from literary study. And it's like, well, if you want to have the story do that, write your own effing story, right? The fact is that what has been presented to us by the play is presented in a certain way to evoke certain kinds of responses, right? So that kind of very subjectivist reading, like, well, I didn't like it because I think that the character should have said this. It's like, well, going back to the new critics that I mentioned in another lecture, it's like, I think they wanted to stave off exactly that kind of thing by saying the text is the text. There's nothing outside the text. We can just focus on the text, right? So as a learning device for those of you who are going to teach Shakespeare in high school, which I don't believe actually, controversial opinion, I don't know why 9th or 10th graders need to read Romeo and Juliet or A Midsummer Night's Dream or anything. I'm giving a defense in some ways of Shakespeare in these lectures. against ways that people might want to just treat him as part of the establishment, but he certainly wasn't a part of the establishment of so-called great literature at the time of his death. So it doesn't seem to be intended on his own part. He didn't want, he wasn't that interested in publishing his plays during his lifetime, as I've said. And so it's only through later cultural situations that he's become the big name that he is. Somehow we've developed educational systems where he must be taught to students like I don't know, 9th and 10th graders who are young, maybe falling in love with each other. The assumption is that they will learn that pity and terror from, oh, let's look at what happened to Romeo and Juliet, and I think that's a really narrow way of thinking about what literature could do. It's a narrow way of thinking about how 9th and 10th graders might, what kind of self-reflection they might have. The same thing when we ask children to read To Kill a Mockingbird, which has children in it. It's about people coming of age, children coming of age, but the whole point is that the children can't see at the same level as the adults in Harper Lee's book, and then people read it in 9th grade and they think, oh, well, that's a kid's book, that's an adolescent book. It's not an adolescent book, it's an adult book. So we get into all sorts of distinctions about literature for children. And we forget that even literature for children is produced by adults for other adults who will buy it, for all of these assumptions that they have about the ways that children will read. So again, that kind of harkens back to that kind of all of the stuff that Bottom is signaling with his kind of censorship language. So to go back to Aristotle's terms, I think one of the distinctions of comedy from tragedy here is that we get a reversal, but we don't get recognition. Something else happens. The dream or the veil gets lifted at the level of the plot, which allows us not to have to think about how things could be better. Although we do see some longing at the end of this time in the forest, we will see some longing of characters to return to order, just the exhaustion of the night, of running around, of not sleeping, or having these fitful sleeps where we have weird dreams. There's a longing for order that's produced in comedy as well. So it is kind of politically ordered. It's not just about a free-for-all. It's not Dionysian in that sense, if we want to look at the Dionysus tragedy. Another ancient Greek play. I think another way to think of this is why action plays are so often politically conservative. Action plays are kind of they're like comedies or action movies, right? What they ultimately do is they return us to order. No matter how many American big blockbuster movies are about the end of the world, right? And so a Marxist perspective might say, I think Slavoj Žižek says something like this, that it might be someone else. We can't. We so can't imagine a change of society that whenever we're in a crisis, the only thing that we can imagine is somebody blowing up the White House, right? Or somebody the end of the world has happened. Now we've had nuclear apocalypse, and now we're in the new state of things, right? There's so many TV shows that have been dealing with this kind of return to a state of nature throughout the early 21st century, which is reflective of our own situation. But what action movies tend to do is they bring us back to order, right? The play with the impulse of does this with it plays with the impulses of tragedy, these big grand things like the end of the world, and often identify some sort of a hero. It could be like Jack Bauer in 24. Kiefer Sutherland has made a career out of this kind of type acting of becoming the hero. Mel Gibson too. The hero goes a little bit crazy, but then things return back to normal. And that hero character in Mel Gibson can be Jesus Christ, or it can be Mad Max. So that's how typecasting kind of works in drama, right? So, but what they do, the action movies do, is they deliver us the kind of comfort that comedy gives us, the return to order. Comedy is not only about laughter then, and when we think about it at this level, it reveals how deeply profound the ability to laugh is. It's not just like a joke is not just a joke, right? That's why we know that there's something underneath it. And comedy is not just about laughing, it's about the structures of society. It's about how do we loosen society enough to keep it productive and generative, in kind of like Titania's sense in her earlier speech about nature, but also to have the kind of order of the city, the polis, Athens, something like that is going on. So Shakespeare has built into, by the time we get to Act 3 and Midsummer Night's Dream, he's built this into a situation where we're able to laugh without inhibition at just about every level of society. The Bottoms, the Oberons, the Titanias, the lovers' quarrels themselves. They're all running around on stage, making fun of each other, sometimes like someone who loves somebody else is calling them some sort of a name, telling each other how much they hate each other. And so then and then of course, as we get to the later acts, we know that we will return to normal. But it's what Shakespeare has done throughout the play to very carefully construct, even with attention to talking about censorship and make fun of people like that, who might say like, oh, you can't do that on stage. He's loosened it up enough for us to all be laughing, and for whatever transgressions are happening on the stage, we're able to relax about it, and we're laughing because we know that there's something sort of deeper that's going on. So here's where I want to go to a psychoanalytic critique briefly. And this is just especially for my students who are, like undergraduate literature students, for the most part. We need to think about different modes of critique, different ways of reading. There's not one way of reading, like I've mentioned in earlier lectures, right? The new critics who want to only focus on the text and say that we don't need to pay attention to literary allusions. I don't know how you do that exactly. But that tends to be a way of taking a kind of democratic approach to a class if you're teaching Shakespeare, to say like, oh, you don't need to look up and do all of this other research, you can just get it from the text. Again, I think that's a problem for assuming that 9th or 10th graders can just understand a Shakespeare play by just handing them the play. I don't think that quite works, even though that might be the ideological assumption of why it's in curriculum. So maybe we should question curriculum a little bit. And it certainly doesn't mean that I don't think that Shakespeare is great, but I think that the battles that we have about the canon of literature, what makes great literature, and whether or not that gets assigned to students in our society, I think that those are questions that you will need to be thinking if you're planning on becoming a teacher who teaches Shakespeare, whether you choose to teach it or whether it's imposed on you to teach. I have no problem generally with people choosing to teach. I have a problem probably as a teacher myself with people imposing it on other people to teach. I think it's an injustice to Shakespeare to say that to impose Shakespeare on other people. I think that Shakespeare warrants being taught and learned about on his own, without other people in sort of higher positions of curricular authority saying, we must do this, you must learn the Shakespeare, like that kind of stuff. all you need to do is kind of like hopefully kind of look into the plays themselves, and they warrant their own exegesis, their interest, their and on its own terms, it speaks to us in all sorts of ways, and we don't need to impose notions of great literature like that any of that those kinds of classist distinctions about art onto this stuff. That's my own opinion. So you can take it for how you will. My purpose here in venturing into psychoanalytic critique is going to, as I said at the beginning of lecture, is more about giving us access to historical distance between ourselves and Shakespeare while illuminating aspects of comedy. So I'm not saying, here is a psychoanalytic critique, like it's a cookie cutter box, I'm going to apply it to the play and we get this. Like, it might be a lens among many different lenses, and the different ways of reading will bring out things in a text. But I am more importantly using psychoanalysis here to kind of historicize it, to say like, wow, this shift happens in the 19th century. Just like the shift to fairies and children that is different from Shakespeare's time, we're so influenced in the 21st century by the 19th century that it makes us, I think, sometimes poorer readers of Shakespeare from his own historical context. So it's not just a strict application of say, Sigmund Freud here, and it certainly is not to say that Sigmund Freud is necessarily correct. Freud is very important for us for the history of literary studies. I'm not using him like to apply some sort of medical diagnosis to somebody right now, but he's important historically, even when he's wrong. And when we notice those ways that he might be wrong, it also gives us a kind of distance to resonate how things might be different between Shakespeare and now. And I think that will importantly inform some of these ways that we think about canons, the ways that we think about whether or not Shakespeare ought to be assigned to high school students in different places in the world. So it could be different. That could mean something different in England than it does in the United States. I think even so we could have some regional discussion there. Certainly means something different in the Caribbean or in India than it does. And there's an overwhelming focus throughout history that people like, well, Shakespeare could speak to anybody and everybody at all times. I think that there are some ideological assumptions when people make those kinds of statements, or that all literature is just about some kind of capital H humanity. I would say rather that capital H humanity that people talk about sort of so flippantly or so universally cast onto the world might have some underlying Euro-Christian ideological baggage that's going on, and I think that is definitely worth critiquing, and part of why I think it's important to look at someone like Shakespeare or anyone from the early modern era, because it gives us a sense of how historical our perceptions about the world and how the world ought to be might be, that they're not transcendent or as transcendent as we might think of them, even though our lives are socially formed to maybe think that the world works in a certain way. So the distance is more important than the psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis has some important things to say. So I'm going to illuminate what I hear about what I've been referring to as the Euro-Christian fantasy structure. I use Euro-Christian all one word, all lowercase. I'm following a colleague of mine actually named Tink Tinker, who's an Osage or Washaje, to use a better pronunciation. He's an Osage thinker and a historian of Native American traditions. But we use the term Euro-Christian, all lowercase, all one word, to designate a social movement, not a religion itself. And there's complicated reasons for that. You can look up Tink Tinker and Euro-Christian if you want. I'm not going to lecture on him. I'm just saying that that's where the term comes from. So a Euro-Christian fantasy structure, fantasy with a PH to designate that this is psychological. It's not F. Different spelling, different connotation. So this Euro-Christian fantasy structure, which is a kind of way of ordering reality based on a worldview that's deeply framed and persistent beneath law and political ideology. This will unfold in several lectures. This is very much part of my work. Roger Green, as the instructor for this course. Other people can argue with it. That's totally fine. That's what literary criticism and discourse and literary theory is. The assumption here is part of my own definition of literature, is that studying literature gives us the ability to track social desire over time. And so what we'll see is that what I'm trying to emphasize is that social desire, maybe in Shakespeare's time, there might be a different social desire than what we might have right now, where we mostly have action movies that are about the end of the world, or long-running TV shows like The Walking Dead that are about like the destruction of all society and perhaps the ways of rebuilding it and who gets to be in charge. You can see some parallel themes to Shakespeare, but I think that the social desire of the contextual historical situation is really different. So by being able to see the European fantasy structure for what it is, I think it helps us illuminate those historical differences. Big thinking, right? Like it's like, how did we get from Midsummer Night's Dream to this? I understand if this feels like like a grand distraction. I will hopefully be bringing this back to this text and to multiple Shakespeare texts that I'm reading this summer and doing lectures on, summer of 2021. So let's look at the unconscious. So basic ideas about psychoanalysis is that it sees the world in terms of an unconscious layer and a conscious layer, or the latent layer is beneath and the manifest content is up top. There's a kind of layer, we call it liminality. So things that are beneath are subliminal, right? And they break through liminality, they become manifest at different times in our life. So there's kind of unconscious desires that are urging us, but there's a level by which we repress them and push them underneath. Like, I can't just have sex with everybody that I find attractive whenever I want to have sex, right? That's just a very basic way of reducing this back to liminality or sexuality. But it could also be like, as much as I like McDonald's hamburgers, they taste good, they go down easy, I probably shouldn't eat them for every meal every day, right? And so that kind of rationalizing force is going to be associated with a superego. But the superego is not just about like me saying Roger, don't do that. It's the development of two voices in my head, right? So it's like Roger, the ego, or I. In Greek, ego just means I. In the unconscious, it's unformed. But when it breaks through into the conscious and becomes a particular desire, I want that hamburger, or I want to tell that person how I feel about them, right? Then it becomes particularized. It becomes part of an ego state. The superego is a kind of separation between these two things. And the superego is formed by other people in society telling me to say no to myself. So the superego is partly a conscience, but it's also a historically and traditionally informed conscience. Right? That also tells us, like, no, in our society, we do not do that. Right? So it's socially formed. It's not just internal to my own head. So if we look about psychoanalytic critique here, the unconscious structures our desires and motivates us to act through our libido, which often gets reduced to just the sex drive, because Sigmund Freud, when he was writing about it, was thinking about Charles Darwin and evolution and the production of the species. So he was thinking at about it kind of at a biological level. Like, what does a species need to do to reproduce? Well, we need to have a structure of desire that tells us when and how we're going to go have sex with the people that we're going to have sex with, and that they will then conceive and then reproduce society. So he's thinking about it in that kind of biological way, which might be a little bit different than the way you've heard about Freud in popular culture. And so it works through repression, right? It says that there's a certain time and a place for things. And that repression is then aligned with the law, at least in Freud, is aligned with the law of the father, which develops and evolves over time into civilization, which becomes a kind of superego establishing a moral awareness. So in the Euro-Christian fantasy structure, this is entirely aligned with a version of rationality that also places men above women, white above non-white, and Euro-Christians above all others, since the development of color or skin color-based race and racism comes from Christians, Euro-Christians, trying to establish their dominance throughout the rest of the world. Not just English people, but European Christians in general, as they go and they seek to explain why they have the right to conquer other lands in papal bulls, like the doctrine of discovery. They then produce the color-based racism to signify their own civilizational and religious superiority. So I use the term Euro-Christian in the place of whiteness, right? For those who want to critique William Shakespeare in a curriculum as being just yet another white man, you might think about that in this term Euro-Christian in the way that I'm using it here. The particularly evolutionary structure of this shows up in the 19th century, especially following Darwin's Origins of the Species and the Descent of Man. So Freud is in his own particular historical context, right? And he starts dealing with this idea of the law of the father. We've seen laws of the father showing up structurally in A Midsummer Night's Dream. One of the reasons that makes Freud so important for literary study is because he was a great reader of myth and literature, which is what he used to articulate all of his ideas, which might not be that great for medical diagnoses today, but it works very well in terms of literary criticism, because he is a good reader of ancient texts, and he comes up with some good ideas, not all good ideas for sure. He's reflecting of his own culture with gendered situations, things like that. So he writes a book in 1913 called Totem and Taboo, where he's dealing with this kind of law of the father issue. And so these are just some quotes I pulled from Totem and Taboo. So he connects taboo, which is the term of like don't. It's actually a Maori term, I believe. So he's pulling from anthropology at the time, and he's trying to give a structure of all humanity. This is what Euro-Christians try to do all the time, is they try to like look at all of the whole development of all of human civilization, and they try to systematize it and package their ways into it. And in that doing so, and trying to make a logical order out of all of that, out of all of civilization or all of history, and making civilization arise from all of human history, they make all sorts of errors. And there's a lot of arrogance in that kind of imposing of a worldview onto the rest of the globe. No matter how there might be some things that are right or correct about it, or how logical it seems, it still becomes an imposition onto the rest of the world. And through economic structures we could talk about today, something like capitalism that comes out of a Euro-Christian tradition, we could see how dominant it is. It becomes so dominant that it seems like the natural way that things just are. But taboo, which is a term taken from Maori people for things not to do, he connects it to the idea of the sacred in the Euro-Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition. And in that tradition, the sacred is something that means set aside, right? So taboo is part of that distinguishing between something that's sacred and something that's not. And so totem and taboo, he says in the book, the taboo prohibitions lack all justification and are of unknown origin. We don't know where the first taboo started out. Something like incest, which is broadly throughout human society something that people aren't supposed to do, even though, I don't know, we could look at the Euro-Christian royal traditions of incest in their families, for example, and we see it happening in Greek culture. So it's something that happens, but it's not maybe supposed to happen. And so Freud is at least upfront enough to say that, like, it doesn't, like, the origin doesn't matter, but other people will try to impose an origin on things. He says maybe it's related to something pre-religious. So he sees religion as a later development of something on the way towards civilization. It's transferable from persons to inanimate objects, and it is the site of pollution. He connects taboo to neurotic and compulsive impulses. Taboos are present as obsessive prohibitions, and they are susceptible to displacement. Taboos are obsessive because somebody says, don't do this, you're not allowed to do this, you're not this. And because you're not allowed to do it, that kind of creates this energy about, well, I'm not allowed to do that, but maybe I want to do that, right? And so touching something taboo can make one taboo. And this is all according to Freud, right? I'm just summarizing him. Violations can be expiated in various types of acts or washing of hands or purification ceremonies. Initial prohibitions appear in, he says, primitive childhood, but then they are maintained throughout repression. So in our childhood, somebody says no, and that creates the repressive structure. And then as we grow up and develop as adults, we are constantly dealing with the ways that things that are repressed break into our consciousness, right? So totemism, which he's taking again from anthropological studies of, quote, other cultures from the Euro-Christian culture around the world, totemism involves the two most important prohibitions, which is the killing of the totem animal or avoiding sex within totem groups. So it's about laws of the father, the totem animal, and saying who you can and or ought to and ought not, more importantly, have sex with. The basis of the taboo is a forbidden action. It's forbidden for which there is a strong inclination in the unconscious. So the more overt that we say something's wrong, the more it's because there might be a repressed desire beneath it. So that's basic Freudian stuff. You might hear stuff that resonates with you and sounds reasonable. You might have like be wanting to prove Freud wrong. That's all fine. You can wrestle with that on your own. What I'm wanting to do here is to distinguish that some of the things that we get in the 21st century and some of the mistakes that Freud makes is he imposes this linear Euro-Christian worldview that's trying to prove Darwinian evolution, which is all coming out of the 19th century, right? He then imposes that onto all of human civilization. And what he does, and what many people, this is where Euro-Christian racism sort of shows itself in daily thoughts, is that they think of like indigenous people as being people of the past. Indigenous people are more pure. Native Americans have a pure spirituality that's connected with a time before civilization, before especially Euro-Christian civilization, where people dealt with a more natural form of religiosity, and that Euro-Christianity or Christian culture and civilization has been corrupted through empire. But yet somehow, if we look at indigenous cultures, for example, because they're more primitive, because they're stuck back in a time of human development that never changed, right? So they're categorized as being unchanging and timeless and ancient. They can become a way of that Euro-Christians can critique themselves and point to something more pure, which all is part of an continued imposition of a Euro-Christian developmental worldview onto other peoples around the world. Right, and that's what Freud is taking Maori concepts like taboo. He's taking totem concepts that show up in throughout North and South America, and he's trying to figure them into this systematic way of thinking about the linear development of civilization, by which he sees the development of many see the development of Christianity being the most highly enlightened and rational form, even from his own Judaic backgrounds, which he'll have some stuff to say about that. He might critique some things about Christianity as well from his Jewish perspective. I'm not going to get into that today. The problem is the imposition of the Euro-Christian fantasy structure onto the rest of the world. When people put Shakespeare into that kind of a linear development and say he is the pinnacle of Euro-Christian civilization, and that's why we should learn him so that we can become encultured to the higher rational ideas of Euro-Christian culture, that's where we get into white supremacy and the persistence of racism. To take all of that and then cast it back on Shakespeare himself as a writer, I think, is unjust and wrong. And so we need to look at what Shakespeare as a writer is doing in terms of his own art, rather than the accepted stance of just assuming that we study Shakespeare to study because he's great, because he's humanity in print. No. I want to give a deeper sort of look. So to come back to the end and to end this lecture today, and we'll come back to these ideas, of course, throughout my summer lectures. Just to come back to the end of Act 3, we're starting to get an arc towards the end of the play, towards a return to order. So Oberon gets mad at Robin, and Robin denies culpability at this point, which is like Act 3, Scene 2, line 347. Oberon says, "This is thy negligence. Still thou mistakest, or else committest thy knaveries willfully." He's like accusing Robin, and Robin says, like, "Believe me, King of Shadows, I mistook. Did not you tell me I should know the man by the Athenian garments he had on? And so far blameless proves my enterprise that I have anointed an Athenian's eyes, and so far am I glad it so did sort. As this their jangling I esteem a sport." So this is the playfulness of Robin Goodfellow, right? The Hobgoblin. He is a kind of trickster character, but he's right. I mean, he didn't do anything that Oberon told him not to do, and it all seems to be sort of playing out in this other type of way. And that's why I think it's like sort of interesting to look at from a psychoanalytic perspective. Is like, well, wow, what is the unconscious ordering of things? It's like or how are we coming back into order from this night of where everything that was repressed sort of gets released? There's nothing, we can't distinguish one thing from another. It's inversions over and over again. And then we start to get the return of order where everybody goes to sleep, and Oberon says, "When they next wake, all this derision shall seem a dream and a fruitless vision, and back to Athens shall the lovers wend, with league whose date till death shall never end. Whiles I in this affair do thee employ, all to my queen and beg her Indian boy, and then I will her charmed eyes release from a monster's view, and all things shall be at peace." So again, the colonialism shows up with the Indian boy here, even in the return to order, right? But what is sort of happening here is also that the night has been this the unconscious, and the king of the night, the fairy king, who's Oberon, is the one who's reestablishing order. He is the parallel to Theseus, the overt the Duke of Athens, right? The founder of society. And so you have this doubled character of the unconscious sort of king, which is Oberon, and the conscious king, which is going to be Theseus. And for all of the difficulties that psychoanalysis gives, when people have tried to impose it onto the Euro-Christian fantasy structure, which Freud definitely played a part in, it's not about him being a Jewish and not a Christian. It's not about identity in that particular way. It's about a received social desire over time. That's why all one word Euro-Christian, all lowercase. It's a social movement. It does, and Jewish people have a way of figuring into that and being repressed within that movement, of course. But it's not about what you identify as your faith and how that interprets your interpretive reading, right? It's about, we're getting at something deeper. And so psychoanalytic language does give us ways to talk about these aspects of the play without sort of just saying that Freud was right and correct on everything about psychoanalysis is great and cheery for the end of all time, right? And there are, of course, so many other psychoanalytic thinkers in the wake of Freud, but these are kind of intro lectures, and I want you to start thinking about literary theory and ways of reading and how that gives us access to different things in texts. So I've done Aristotle today, I've done psychoanalysis today, I've hinted in earlier lectures at new criticism, which developed in the 20th century as well. And these are all just to give you a sense of the different kind of lenses that we could bring to someone like Shakespeare. And my overall point, again, because I'm informed by great scholars of my era, like Stephen Greenblatt, who's a new historicist, and he has this idea of cultural poetics, which kind of combines all of this stuff. I'm very influenced by Greenblatt, so just saying where I'm kind of getting a big influence from me reading Shakespeare anyway. What I want us to see is some historical difference between Shakespeare's time and now, because it gives us a sense of what our own ideological situation is and the persistence of the European fantasy structure. We will continue with Act 4. Thank you for watching and listening, as always.